Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Mindy Romero, and I'm the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Price School of Public Policy. I'm also faculty there. The title of today's webinar is Voter Messaging in an Inequitable Outreach and Information Landscape, Strategies for the 2024 Election. This webinar presents new findings from a brand new CID report looking at the barriers to casting a ballot that California eligible voters can experience, their knowledge and awareness of voter information and their voter options, as well as the impact of different types of potentially the impact of different types of voter messaging on the likelihood of them actually casting a ballot. So the webinar, as I think most of you are aware, is part of a larger webinar series that CID is hosting over a period of 5 weeks in May and June. The last one is June 11th. Each webinar is on a Tuesday from noon to 12:45 Pacific time, 45 minutes short and sweet. And we're presenting research at each of those webinars. But the overall theme of the webinar series is to discuss voter turnout and outreach in California. And of course, we hope that our findings and our data are also helpful for folks in other states, as the challenges in California are certainly overlap with the challenges across the United States. Again, our webinar today, Voter Messaging in an Inequitable Outreach and Information Landscape, Strategies for the 2024 Election. There we go. Again, part of our larger CID webinar series on voter turnout and outreach in California. And the subtitle to that series is, Will Voters Turn Out in November? Opportunities and Challenges to Conducting Voter Outreach in 2024. This is, again, the webinar, but the actual report that we're presenting today, the data from the report that we're presenting today, has a similar name, Voter Messaging in California, Challenges and Opportunities in an Inequitable Election Landscape. Again, available now on our website. So why inequitable election landscape? Why are we using that term? What do we mean? What is that? So 3 points here that I want to dive into a little bit. So much more could be said, of course, for time, but for time we're limited. So essentially, in California, as well as the rest of the United States, right, we have had long entrenched disparities in voter participation rates, voter turnout rates, significant differences by race, ethnicity, age, disability status, those where we have data for other historically underrepresented groups as well. This has been present in our most recent elections. It's been present historically. And we unfortunately expect, right, these disparities to continue. The question is how, of course, to address them and eventually eliminate them, or at least significantly reduce them. So we start with people's experiences, people's engagement with the election system and with voting at very different levels. So that being said, there's very significant reasons why we have these entrenched disparities. It's not that people are just simply apathetic or don't care. Many voters feel disconnected from the political process. And a little bit, we'll talk about some of the reasons that people have cited for not voting. But I do want to point out, when I talk about outreach and voter engagement, that we have an inequitable voter outreach and engagement landscape. So one reason, not the only reason, but one reason why we have significant disparities in turnout is that our election system engages with different groups in different ways and to different degrees. And so largely the way our election system is designed in the United States and in California is that it's the campaigns and candidates that are doing the overwhelming majority of outreach, knocking on doors, soliciting, asking people to vote. But of course, they are not trying to get everybody to vote. They're just trying to get the people they think are going to vote for them. They're doing that in a very targeted way. And often they're not trying to get all the people that are going to vote for them. If they're in a non-competitive or very safe seat, maybe they're just trying to get just the people they need to win, right? And most candidates, there are always exceptions, but most candidates and campaigns use what we call what we call a likely voter model. So through big data, they understand, and voter records, who are the people that are most likely to vote, and they target, as they want to look for the biggest bang for their campaign dollars, they target those people that are high propensity, very likely voters. Some go above and beyond. Of course, if it's a very competitive, you may see more outreach to groups that don't vote as much, or at least individuals that are identified as less likely to vote. But overall, that's the the drive, right, in terms of how campaigns are run in the United States. And that means that we have this vicious cycle that in any given election, there are whole swaths of our eligible voter population, even of our registered voter population, that get very little outreach and voter education because they don't fall into that likely voter model. Young people, voters of color, low income voters, right, notably. So then we have the voter outreach efforts of California election officials, elections offices, and community organizations. Election officials, of course, their task is to get information out to voters to make sure the election is known and they can administer it appropriately and according to law. Many election officials also want to go above and beyond, and they want to see higher turnout, even though they're not tasked with that necessarily. And we know community organizations, nonprofit, nonpartisan groups, often want and do work in this space to get more people out to vote, but are often focused on narrowing those disparities in turnout that I just mentioned. But the scale of need is something that is not reached, right? The resources are not yet available to make up that. What we're starting with is an inequitable landscape, right? Because of campaigns, as I've mentioned, and the ability for election officials and nonprofit groups, community groups, and others to be able to kind of make up that gap is quite a hard task to do. All right. So the study, so that's the framing, just to explain the language that we're using. Now, the study itself presents findings on the following factors in California voter turnout. We, of course, in one report, can't address everything, but we think this information is helpful. And we note that next week we have another report that is focused on specifically voting methods and why groups are and individuals, maybe the reasoning behind their choice of voting method, vote by mail, for instance, in person, drop box, and a lot of information around how they navigate their options and choices. Okay, so we're looking at barriers experienced by eligible voters when casting a ballot, eligible voters' knowledge and awareness of voting information, and the impact, as I mentioned on the outset of this webinar, of voter-related messages. We do actually testing through experimental treatments, survey treatments of different messages and the impact of the likelihood of people casting a ballot. I gave you the link in the chat, but you can also find it on our website, the new report and other work, cid.usc.edu. And of course, we want to note that this research was generously supported through funding of the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. And we thank them very much for their support in making this research possible. A little bit about the survey, because this report presents everything from, not everything, the data source for this report is solely our California Voter Experience Survey. This is a survey we've done now for a number of years in California. This is the 2024 edition. We examine the experiences of eligible voters in California. This was recently fielded in January and February, a very large representative sample of eligible voters. The report gives you more detail on the methodology, but we do provide a representative sample by race and ethnicity, and also weights where needed. Conducted in both English and Spanish. Of course, we wish that we could have conducted it in additional languages, but for resources, we are not able to do so. And we note that, of course, everything that we're presenting, right, we're not able to make a direct, and we're not trying to make a direct relationship between the responses of survey participants and specific voter outreach efforts, either by election officials or community groups in California counties. And what you'll find on our website is very soon there is a companion 3-page summary brief of the full report, and very soon also will be all of the data broken out by subgroup and also broken out by LA County, just in the online appendix. Okay, possible voting barriers, that first item on the list. So we asked what, and now I'm just going to run you through the responses that we received. And again, these are representative of eligible voters in California. So what was the reason you did not vote in the California November 22 general election? You'll see that this was select all that apply. Many people could choose. People could choose multiple answers, and some did. So we don't add up to 100% here. About a little over a quarter of eligible voters said that didn't vote. said that they didn't vote because they were not interested. Another 17%, which is about, I think, the fourth or fifth item down, said they weren't registered. Another 15% that said they didn't like the candidates. I also want to point out here that another almost 11% said they didn't feel like they knew enough about the choices. Another 7% said they didn't trust government institutions. And we note in the report that when people say that they are not interested, there are often many reasons why people actually will note that as the reason for not participating. People can feel very disconnected from the political process. There can be overlap with distrust in government institutions. There can be lack of outreach, right, from campaigns. Generally speaking, of course, historic and current structural barriers that impact people's awareness of and connection to the political process, the information that they receive. And so when you see I'm not interested, that is a simple response, right, that voters will give that can say so much more. And I want to caution people to don't interpret that as going down the apathy path. For some people, they may be apathetic, but often they're not interested for a variety of reasons that fall maybe more under disconnection. Then we broke out the survey responses on this question by race, ethnicity. And you can see just on the three that I've highlighted, there's so much going on here, but of course, this is just a highlight webinar of the research. You can see that I'm not interested was a quarter, right, for everyone, but for Black voters and AAPI voters, the proportion of those groups was a little higher. Did not like candidates, higher for Black voters, higher for white voters. And I'm not registered, also variation here you can see as well. And again, I welcome you to dive into all of these tables to see the nuances by some of the other answers that I've already listed. Do you have concerns when it comes to casting your ballot in the upcoming November 2024 general election? And here, about 30%, right, just over 30% of eligible voters that we surveyed said that they did indeed have concerns. And then we broke that out. Of those people that said they had concerns, what were those concerns, right? But first, let me just break you out here in terms by this initial question in terms of having concerns. If we look at it by race, ethnicity, we see higher concerns for Black voters, higher concerns for white voters. And now let's talk about the kinds of concerns that you have when you're casting your ballot in the November 2024 general election. So the number one cited concern, again, this is of people who said they had a concern, which is about 30% of eligible voters. The number one, you can see there in the middle, it's highlighted 33.5%. So about a third of these people that had concerns said they had a concern that their ballot might not be counted accurately. Another 29% said they might have to stand on a long line to cast their ballot in person. And another 28% or so said my vote by mail ballot might be tampered with and my vote changed. So a lot of concern around security, but also access in person. And again, here breaking it out by race, ethnicity, we see differences in the level of concern by racial or ethnic group. So Black and white, non-Latino. Oh, so sorry. Let me, the top three reasons kind of varied. And I don't here for time show a breakout by age or by disability status, but the report does, in the body of the report, break all of this out by age as well as disability status, and you'll see there are quite significant differences, particularly for older and younger voters on their concerns around voting, on their information sources, and many of the survey questions that we asked. So here, what aspects of the voting process did not satisfy you in the November 22 general election? And I apologize, this is a big table and it's really hard to read. It's hard for me as well. And this, by the way, is of all eligible voters, whether they voted or not, because you can ask what process did not satisfy. For some, that meant maybe they didn't vote. For some, they voted, but they registered a level of dissatisfaction. So 30%, the top reported reason here was that they did not feel comfortable or confident that their ballot would be counted correctly. But again, you'll see here about 17% saying they didn't trust the USPS. Another 13% said they lack lack of voting materials in their preferred language. Another 17%, the flow of the process for casting their ballot. And again, for time, I invite you to look at this in more detail later. What aspect of the voting process did not satisfy you? Again, same question here, but asking it or breaking it out as I present it by race, ethnicity. And you can see that there were some significant differences even on the first question about my ballot being counted accurately. Big differences by race, ethnicity, 6%, 23, 40, 23. Next question. Did you visit multiple in-person voting locations to avoid lines on the day that you cast your ballot? So this population, of course, is those that actually voted in the most recent 2022 general election. And 21.9% said that they did visit multiple. How many? We don't know. Maybe it was just two. And of course, we note here that in California, 29 in 2022, it was 27 of our state's 58 counties are utilized a model, if you're familiar with it, called the Voters' Choice Act, that instead of neighborhood polling places, utilizes vote centers that are available to voters up to 10 days before Election Day. And voters are no longer married to an individual location. They can go to any vote center and cast their ballot without having to cast a provisional ballot. And those 29 or 27 counties in 2022 equated to about 3/4 of the state's actual eligible voter population, because it encompasses large counties like Orange and LA. By race, ethnicity. So did you visit multiple in-person locations? Again, all voters was about 22%, slightly higher for Black, less for Latino, higher for white, less and lower for AAPI. Voters' knowledge and awareness. So here we're asking largely about voting information sources, and in a moment we'll also ask about the deadline around casting or receiving a vote by mail ballot. So the first question here is, where do you typically turn for help with questions about registration or voting procedures or important election dates? And again, here it's select all that apply. So we're not going to add up to 100%. But you can see the top 3 information sources, if you will, are all sources that are a product in one way or another of a local elections office. So the County Voter Information Guide at 32%, the county website at 28%, and the vote by mail packet at 27%. And this is something we saw across racial and ethnic groups, across age. But there's also notably some other areas here. So social media at 14%, friends and family at 20%, none at 11%, actually contacting directly my elections office at 9.1%, advertisements by community groups, media 10%. And then if we break it out by race, ethnicity, we again see some differences. So we just look at County Voter Information Guide. It was 32% for all eligible voters, but it's more for white voters, a little less for AAPI, and significantly less for Black and Latino voters as well. We see differences by race, ethnicity when we look at website, vote by mail packet, and some of the noteworthy differences here in terms of other non-election offices. Let's just look at social media. So 14% for all eligible voters, but we see 16% for Black, 15% for Latino, and a little bit less for AAPI and white. And then we look at friends and family, 20% again for everybody, but a little bit higher for Latino, and lower for AAPI and Black. How did you hear about the options for how to cast your vote in your county in the November 22 general election? And again, here I'm showing you data for all eligible voters. This is select all that apply. Again, those top 3 areas, County Voter Information Guide, county website, when we ask the specific information about how to cast your ballot. And we know from previous surveys, California Voter Experience surveys that we have done the last few election cycles, that voters will often report not fully knowing, actually overwhelming majority of eligible voters in the state not knowing that there were changes in the options that were available in terms of how to cast their ballot. And there are variation over the years in terms of how people actually hear about those options if they've heard about them. But the top three areas or information sources typically have remained the same, some slight differences in terms of race, ethnicity, and age. But it's these three main sources, right, from the county elections office. But again, we also see social media at 21%, friends and family at 13%, political campaigns, local community groups, media at 17.9%. The Secretary of State's office, statewide voter advocacy groups, and then also called my elections office. So people calling their elections office to get that information. How did you hear about the options for how to cast your vote in your county in the November 22 general election? So here, if we just look at County Voter Information Guide, again, we do see some pretty big differences. And again, this is specific to options, right? Asking or getting information on options. All eligible voters was almost 37%. AAPI at 31, but white non-Hispanic 45, Latino 25, and Black 30. And if we move down to social media, again, 21 for everybody, we see lower for AAPI, we see higher for white, we see a little bit higher for Latino, and lower for AAPI, higher for white, lower actually for social media for Latino here and Black here as well for this specific question. And then if we look at friends and family, again, 13.7% for everyone. And it's, a tiny bit higher for AAPI, a little bit lower for white, about the same for Latino as it worked out, and a tiny bit lower for Black. So actually not a lot of variation for this specific question across race or ethnicity. Differences, though, by political campaign as an option, differences by statewide voter advocacy groups in terms of, again, being their information source. So just want to point that out and invite you to get into the weeds on these tables. To your knowledge, in California, when does a vote by mail ballot have to arrive at the local elections office to be counted? So if you're not aware, this has fluctuated in recent elections, but if you're not aware, now in California, when you mail a vote by mail ballot, if you do, it can be counted if it is postmarked on election day and it arrives. So it can arrive after election day, as long as it arrives within 7 days and it has that postmark of election day, then it will be counted. But we know from other research that we've done that there seems to be or has been some lack of awareness of voters in terms of what the law actually says, right, is permissible here. And so we included a survey question this year to try to better understand that. So you can see here that for the correct answer, which is the one on the bottom, after election day with postmark indicating it had been sent on election day or before, is 28% of all eligible voters. And this is, again, whether they voted or not. But, the overwhelming majority got the question or got the answer wrong. We look by race ethnicity. If we just look at that, the right answer, so the third one down here, there's that 28% for everybody. And much smaller percentages of Black eligible voters got that question right. Latino also lower, white higher, and AAPI higher. And I'll note here, without saying there's a causal connection, but I'll note here that vote by mail rates have historically been higher in California for white and AAPI voters. All right. Again, big differences by race, ethnicity, also disability status here, and for young people, much smaller proportions of them knew the right answer, if you will. And I do hesitate a little bit framing it that way. This is a key piece of information that if you use a vote by mail ballot, you need to know in California. And so it's not that we're blaming voters for not knowing that information, but highlighting the fact that obviously the data, I think, suggests more outreach and voter education around the deadline, or at least around what is legally permissible. I shouldn't say deadline. What is legally permissible? Okay, so now we're going to talk about our voter messaging experiment. Let me back up for a second. So we have conducted the similar experiments like this before in our survey, and our work has been wonderfully informed by a whole host of advocates in this state in terms of the wording and the language that we're using. We hope that the message testing here is helpful for both advocates, election officials, and others in 2024 and potentially beyond. And so before I talk a little bit more about the survey specifics or the message experiments specifically, just as a reminder here, California voters, of course, have multiple options to cast their ballot. So they can, whether they're in a Voters' Choice Act county or a traditional polling place county, they can, everybody who's registered will automatically get a vote by mail ballot that's sent to them in our state. They have choices. They can mail that ballot in. They can drop it off at a staffed voting location. They can drop it off at a unstaffed drop box, or they can choose to actually go in person and vote in person at a in-person voting location or vote center or polling place. So for those options, we started with our understanding from previous research that a lot of voters aren't fully aware, the majority of California voters aren't fully aware of those options. And there's been a lot of interest over the years in how to better inform eligible voters of their options, what messages could give them that information, but also very specifically could potentially, once they receive that message, increase their likelihood of voting. So what message works, but also could they increase the likelihood of an individual actually votes after receiving that message at some point. So let me move on. I already talked about this, that in every election cycle since 2020, our voter experience survey has found that an overwhelming majority of California voters were not aware of those changes. And so for this report, we tested 4 messages with survey respondents that convey information about the options that eligible voters in the state now have, right, when they cast their ballot. And the focus of this approach was to identify any impact of those messages, again, on the likelihood of voting. I want to make sure that that's clear. Here's the first message. And this message we call, it went out to our survey. So one segment of the 12,000 eligible, nearly 12,000 eligible voters that took the survey received this message alone, which states in California, you can vote early and have options to vote. Every registered voter in California will receive a ballot in the mail about a month before the election. There are 3 ways you can cast your ballot. You can return your ballot by mail, you can drop it off at an official location, or you can vote in person at a voting location. Then another segment of the survey respondents received that core message, but then an additional line that you can see here highlighted in red. So it's the same core message in black that I just read you. And then they also see California's election officials have worked to ensure that all of these voting options are secure and safe with protections in place to prohibit voter fraud. So for short here, we're calling it the prohibit voter fraud message. Why are we focused on this? Do we expect that there could be significant differences potentially in the impact on voting of this message by demographic group? Yes. And we know from our other survey questions, right, other findings in the survey, that there's a lot of conversation around voter fraud across racial and ethnic groups, across age groups, but variation, right, within those groups. So we examine, right, what this type of language would mean. I should say in all of these messages that we test, we're not suggesting that this be the exact language that people use, right? We're testing it as researchers to hopefully add to the conversation, right, when groups, election officials, and others are considering crafting messages. All right. Next is, there's a lot going on here. I'm going to give you some findings in a moment, but what you see here is the difference in the likelihood of voting over the control group. So the control group just got, I should say, let me back up, forgive me. We asked everyone, this is not the difference yet. We asked everyone just first, how likely are you to vote in the 2024 presidential election? And you can see pretty large percentages here. If we just focus on extremely likely, we did ask on a scale. So extremely likely, somewhat unlikely. Sorry, extremely likely, somewhat likely, neither, somewhat unlikely, and extremely unlikely. And if we just focus on the blue bar, those that said that they are extremely likely to vote in the upcoming 2024 presidential election, you can see for the total, it was about almost 2/3, 65%. For Black, 55%, for AAPI, 60%, for Latino, 52%, and for White, 74.8%. Now, we note in the report, and please hear me as well, as researchers, we have to be responsible and make sure folks understand that when surveys, public opinion polls ask a question like this right before an election, particularly months before an election, and they ask people their likelihood of voting, that we know in the field that in the elections science field and the political science and voter behavior field, that people can often be unreliable, or at least they are somewhat unreliable in their prediction about whether they are going to vote or not. Often people are overly optimistic even about whether they are going to vote or not. And of course, there can be many factors that can contribute to why they may or may not vote, right, between when they are surveyed and election day or election season, or individually, right, things that could become barriers that could mean that their preference or their statement could be different than actual behavior come election time. So with that note, really the purpose of showing you these numbers, we think they're still interesting and helpful. But really the idea here is that we ask this question because this is our control, right, for the messaging to be able to see as people receive the different messages and then are also asked about likelihood of voting. Does their likelihood go up or down in what they state in terms of voting based on the message or the different message that they received? So we're testing the message's impact on their likelihood of voting. Hopefully that makes sense. But I will note that these numbers here that we see are fairly in line, unfortunately, because there are significant disparities here in the likelihood of voting, but they're fairly in line with what we saw in 2020 in terms of eligible voter turnout by race ethnicity. We are not saying that these will be the exact numbers. I never predict turnout in any sort of election. Again, there will be differences. These will not be the exact numbers, but these give you a sense, if you are interested, in where people are at now in thinking about their likelihood of voting. Okay, so voter messaging experiment. Again, a lot's going on here. What I want to have you focus on is just that blue bar, which is extremely likely. And you will see that across the messages, there are some differences. This is if somebody received the voting options message versus somebody received the additional safety voter fraud, that's the second one there in line, or if they received the voting options message with the safety voted counted message, or they received it with the community empowerment message. So differences in likelihood of voting by type of message. And we do see some positives by the safety prohibit voter fraud message. People that got that message had a 2.7 percentage point positive difference in their likelihood of voting over the control group. And a voting options message with community empowerment had a 2.8 percentage point difference in the positive direction over the control group in their likelihood of voting, meaning that message actually had the largest positive effect in terms of likelihood of voting or on somebody's likelihood of voting. Again, a lot's going on here, and we welcome you to look at the report to parse that out further. Now here, if we look by race ethnicity, pretty significant differences. If we just look again at those blue bars, and we really could be looking at somewhat likely as well, but for today, I'm just trying to keep it simple. Here across the top, if you don't see it, it's total Black, AAPI, Latino, and White. And now we're just focused in on the voting options message itself, right, without the additional messages. And you can see out of all the groups here that we break out, the most positive in terms of likelihood of voting or impact on likelihood of voting at the extremely likely level is for AAPI at 5.7 percentage points, higher than the control group, and then White non-Latino at 4 percentage points. We can look here for the safety prohibit voter fraud message. And what's going to stand out here to you, again, looking at that blue, extremely likely, this is the impact of this message on these groups' likelihood of voting in November. And you see 8.6 percentage points positive, right, effect in terms of extremely likely for Black respondents, and 9 percentage points for AAPI. Again, this is over the control group. And so you can see breaking up by race ethnicity is very important, right? Because different impacts. This is the, again, voting options message with the safety vote counted additional language. And we see some really positive impacts here for Black at 7.9 percentage points and AAPI at 9.2 percentage points in terms of extreme impact on extremely likely over the control group. And then the community empowerment message. I noted at the outset that that was a message that had by 2.8 percentage points. It was a message overall for everybody that had the highest impact on the likelihood of voting for the folks that got that message over the control group. And here, if we break it out, we can see a much more positive impact in this message, right, for AAPI. All right, so that was a lot. Hopefully I've given you a taste of this. Again, we invite you to look at the report. So summary, nearly 2/3 of eligible voters report that they are extremely likely to vote in the November 2024 general election. White non-Latinos had the highest proportion of respondents who said they are extremely likely to vote of any racial or ethnic group examined, 74%. These are the other numbers also for AAPI, Latino, and Black. And again, please note those very important caveats that I made when presenting those data. And there it is again, but survey responses on likelihood of voting can be unreliable, especially this far out. When provided with the four types of voter messages, survey respondents were overall most responsive to the voting options message. This is overall. That included the community empowerment language. And that language, in a nutshell, was along with the core messages telling people, right, that their community civil rights organizations are urging them to vote in their communities. And that's the language. And that's the additional line that we added. They're highly responsive also to the voting options message that cited safety and prohibiting voter fraud. And AAPI and Black survey respondents responded the most positively to all voter messages tested overall. A couple more bullet points here. AAPI survey respondents responded the most positively when provided the standard voting options message with 5.7, I should say, percentage points, saying they were extremely likely to vote. And AAPI Black survey respondents responded the most positively when they got the message that included voter fraud prevention. And that was 9, and I showed you this earlier, of course, in the chart, but 9 percentage points and 8.6 percentage points, respectively, in terms of extremely likely to vote over the control group. AAPI survey respondents responded the most positively when provided a message that included a community empowerment language with 8.2 percentage points higher, right, for extremely likely to vote. And then lastly, just double check, lastly, AAPI and Black survey respondents responded the most positively when provided a message with assurances of votes being counted. This is over other groups and the control group. Okay, planning voter outreach for the 2024 general election. All right, so in all of that, the report gives some recommendations. So voter groups need targeted outreach that addresses the differential experiences of each group with regard to the voting and election process, right? The different experiences, the different barriers, the different levels of knowledge and awareness, different where there are different differences in information sources, and certainly different responses, right, to messaging. When messaging to voters about the options they have to cast their ballot, consider including an community empowerment language. And then access versus security. Some voters need messaging targeted to assist them with gaining access to the voting process. And this is something I didn't talk much about because I didn't show you the data for broken out by age cohort. But when we talked about barriers and reasons for concerns around voting and barriers to voting, there is an age distinction, right? For younger than 45, particularly 18 to 24, more likely than older voters to want to to be concerned around access, right? Knowing where their location is and being able to get access to their location. And so we think that's important, right, when outreaching to younger voters. Campaigns need varying messaging to address the concerns, of eligible voters and to be more effective across demographics of race, ethnicity, age, disability status. Eligible voters of different subgroups, of course, as we've already stated, respond more positively to some messages over others. And again, we saw in 2 different surveys, right, where it was a broader question and more of a specific question, that again, official voter materials are the most trusted source of information across the board, although there are some differences by race, ethnicity, and age. These materials, therefore, should be easy to use, written in plain language, available in different formats, and languages to ensure all voters have access, right, and that these materials are accessible. Friends and family are a key information source. You saw those data, particularly for Latinos and younger voters. Both groups turn to friends and family for information at higher rates than other groups do. Older eligible voters rely more on the county voter information guide. Again, that's highlighted in the report. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Someone asked for me to share the presentation. Yeah, we're happy. Again, we're recording this and we're going to be sharing the recording and the slides on our website, along with the, of course, report that's already there and a 3-page summary that's a little more easily digestible, I think, for folks. The community empowerment message was the same core message with an additional line saying that that civil rights groups were urging voters to vote in their communities. And share the report. For those of you that might have joined late, let me put in the chat again, because I think you don't see the chat right if you join late. So let me put this in the chat again. That is the link to, the first link is the link to the reports. The second link is the link to our broader webinar series. And yes, as a matter of fact, give me one moment and I'll read you the exact language of each one if people are interested. Again, we also, of course, have it listed in our report as well. Somehow my slide disappeared. So the control group, the voting options message with no additional language, for those of you that want it now, are in California, you can vote early and have options to vote. Every registered voter in California will receive a ballot in the mail about a month before the election. There are 3 ways you can cast your ballot. You can return your ballot by mail or drop it off at an official location, or you can vote in person at a voting location. So I showed you that slide. Again, the next one had an additional message that we categorize shorthand as prohibiting voter fraud. That additional line was California's election officials have worked to ensure that all of these voting options are secure and safe with protections in place to prohibit voter fraud. You saw that slide as well. The next message, which I didn't have a slide for, was the same core message, but with an additional line that we've categorized as the vote counted message. So the additional line is California elections officials have worked to ensure that all of these voting options are secure and safe with protections in place to ensure your vote is counted. And lastly, the community empowerment message, again, same core. And the additional line is California's civil rights organizations urge people to make their voices heard by voting in their communities. All right, hopefully that answered the questions there. Let me see if I have an additional question. Was there data to explore the not interested and did not like candidates in more depth? So in what direction? If you want to, I'm happy to stay on here an extra minute if you have any specific question. Generally speaking, as you saw in the percentages, right, it's a much smaller proportion of the overall respondent pool that selected those. We could do some additional work on that, but I think it would have to be really targeted. Happy to look at the survey responses again and the data if you have a specific question. This is an anonymous attendee, but if you want to email us after the fact, email me, msromero@usc.edu. I'm happy to explore whatever your question might be in terms of specifics. Okay. I don't think I have any other questions. All right. Oh, another person, reasons why media influence, etc. Okay. Email me and happy to talk further about that. All right, everyone. So thanks for bearing with me. I gave you a lot of data, and I realize, of course, that the discussion specifically around voter messaging um, is a lot to take in charts. So really, the idea is that we're just giving you some highlights, and you can take the report and dig into depth. If anyone has questions after you do that, feel free very much to contact me or my team. We are very happy to meet with anybody, work through the data, give presentations on the data to any organizations that might find that useful, as always. Again, recordings will be available soon, and we invite you to next week's webinar. Again, noon to 12:45, same time, same station. And we will be releasing new research that is largely focused on people's selections of the voting method that they use, and why, and information sources around that. Thank you all very much. Have a great rest of the day.